On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to talk about global warming. Gary Stearman has written a cover story for our June 2007 magazine, and he has enlightened us on the real reason behind global warming. Gary Stearman is here with the story.
Well, JR, I've written the article entitled Global Warming, the Sun, and the Apocalypse. Now, anyone who has even a slight familiarity with the Bible will realize that the Bible has a lot to say about the sun, particularly in view of God's judgment. Today, we're going to talk about the phenomenon called global warming in that context, in the context of the Bible. Now, JR, the powers that be refer to global warming as anthropogenic climate change, meaning that the activities of human beings are responsible for causing the temperature of the planet to rise. Is that true, or is it false? I think we're going to find out from the Bible that it's not man causing that global warming. It's in the hands of God.
Well, what about all of these greenhouse gases that the humans are putting off with burning fossil fuels and all of that? Our government says that's what's causing climate change. The Europeans claim that's what's causing climate change. Al Gore claims that's what's causing the change. He has a little video out called An Inconvenient Truth. Tell us, what's the truth, Gary?
Well, JR, carbon dioxide has increased in the Earth's atmosphere to a very, very minor degree. If you look at percentages, a very small percentage due to the activities of man. Actually, if you look back over the recent past, carbon dioxide modulates upward and downward on a gradual scale, not dramatic, as some are saying. But in fact, there is a much broader way to track the planet's temperature over the last literally 1,000 years, from about 1000 AD until the present. There is a very accurate way of looking at the climate historically, and it tells an entirely different story.
Tell us about it. How does it work?
Well, the interesting thing is that around 1000 AD, the planet experienced a warm spell. In fact, in 982, it's a historic fact that Eric the Red, the Norwegian explorer, came across from Norway to Iceland with his Vikings, and then they came westward to a place they called Greenland. And they called it green because the whole southern end of this island was green. It was lush. It supported grapevines and fruit trees and agriculture, and they said, this is a wonderful place. And they set up several communities there. They had trading routes that went back to Norway. And for several hundred, about 4 centuries actually, they lived there quite happily. And in fact, would you believe that there was even a diocese of the Norwegian church established in Greenland? Now, if you go to that same place today, JR, it's covered with 100 feet of ice or more. Some places 500 feet of ice.
What happened? What caused that?
It got cold. Not warm, it got cold. Because what happened immediately after that was called the Little Ice Age. Now, maybe you haven't heard of the Little Ice Age, but from the 13th century, really to the mid-19th century, there was a distinct cooling of the climate. And historians refer to it as the Little Ice Age. This is what covered Greenland with ice. And in fact, it reached a sort of a minimum in the year 1670. And guess what happened in that year, JR?
What?
What happened is there were no sunspots. In fact, an astronomer named Maunder tracked the occurrence of sunspots over a 1,000-year period, and there was a minimal number of sunspots from about 1645 to 1715, and during that period of time, it was very, very cold in the northern hemisphere. In fact, so cold that people feared that they were not going to be able to grow crops. The cooling of the northern hemisphere was directly attributable to what's called the Maunder minimum, meaning the fewer sunspots, the cooler the temperature in the northern hemisphere. Guess what's been happening in the last 10 to 12 years on planet Earth? Abnormally high numbers of sunspots. And we've seen a corresponding rise in temperature, not only on planet Earth, but also on Mars, also out in the depths of space.
Now, Gary, it wasn't too long ago that we had a magazine cover with the Earth draped in ice.
Yes.
Because the big story back then, I don't recall the exact year, but we'll put the picture up there so you can see it. And in fact, in our post-production, we'll have Jared to put the date across the bottom. Everybody thought there was going to be an ice age.
Sure, and in fact, oceanographers are viewing the Atlantic with some trepidation. They're saying the Gulf Stream, which flows north out of the Gulf of Mexico and all the way up to past Greenland, past Iceland, and into the British Isles, the North Sea, and it warms up Europe. So that Europe, which lies in the latitudes as far north as Canada, actually has a much warmer climate than Canada because of the Gulf Stream. Now, if that ever stopped, Europe would freeze, and they're saying that up in Germany, up in Denmark, certainly in the Scandinavian countries, crops would fail because of global cooling. Now,
well, do you remember that Hollywood movie a few years ago when everybody had to migrate to Mexico?
Oh, yes.
Because of the ice age.
The ice age.
And there was New York City, you know, under hundreds and hundreds of feet of ice. This is crazy.
Well, JR, what we have, I think, upon examination, is the discovery that the sun is much more important to climate than anything in our whole scheme. Let's talk about the sun for a moment. I think of the sun as a thermonuclear furnace designed expressly by God to warm this planet in a precise way to support life in comfort. The sun has a diameter of 1,390,000 kilometers. The Earth's diameter is 12,756 kilometers. The sun is 109 times the diameter of the Earth. And the mass of the solar system, JR, it's interesting. You take the sun and all the planets as a whole, 99.8% of the mass of the solar system resides in the sun. The Earth is less than 1/10 of 1% of the mass of the solar system. Without that furnace out there, there wouldn't be any kind of warming. This Earth would be an absolute ice cube. We'd be somewhere down around 275 degrees below zero, frozen solid without a hope. And in fact, if the sun even diminished its output slightly, we'd begin to freeze very quickly. In other words, the biggest thing we have in our environment that's causing any kind of heating at all is the sun. And that sun is continually bubbling, it's storming, it has sunspots bubbling, huge solar prominences, magnetic storms that hurl out tons of charged particles, some of them coming very close to the Earth. And JR, these are the largest factors in the composition of our climate.
So man is not really the culprit in this situation. Now, our government is even suggesting a bill to make it against the law to talk about this. And
That's right.
And to cast disparagingly upon global warming.
In truth, because global warming is actually a kind of a religion with its own priesthood, its own indulgences. It asks offenders to pay fines, to pay higher taxes. In other words, if you sin by producing too much carbon dioxide, you are asked to make reparations. And in other words, it's considered almost a crime to speak against a particular theory of global climate change. This is nothing more to me than a religion with its own priesthood.
And its indulgences, you say?
Yes, indeed.
In other words, you can pay money for the privilege of breaking the law?
Oh, yes, by purchasing carbon credits from people who produce less carbon than you. And to me, these are nothing more than indulgences.
Well, now, in this article, you have talked about science is called Earth, the Goldilocks planet. Explain that, Gary.
Well, as a matter of fact, it is the Goldilocks planet. And everybody knows that story about Goldilocks came to the home of the three bears and tried the porridge and tried the chairs and the beds. And, of course, she always wanted the one that was just right. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And that's Earth. JR, we have perfect radiation. We have perfect light. That is, the spectrum that comes from the sun is perfect for the sustenance of human life and endeavor. It's not too hot, not too cool. That sun is perfectly adjusted. It fluctuates ever so slightly, but it was produced by the hand of God to sustain human life. And that's the difference between me and those who boost the thought pattern which espouses anthropogenic climate change as the culprit, because I don't believe in that at all. I think the sun was created and it is being controlled by the Creator himself.
So that he can turn the thermostat up or down.
Absolutely.
Joel has a prophecy that, is, of course, has become the benchmark of all biblical prophecies, where he says, I will show wonders in the heavens above, and in the earth blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. So there's coming a time when the earth will experience some kind of a freezing, because the sun is going to go out. I don't know how long. How long would it take the sun to be out to really affect the earth?
Only minutes, actually. We are 8 minutes away from the sun. If the sun went out entirely, just went black, we would still think it was shining for 8 minutes, and then it would go black. And I expect within perhaps 4 to 5 hours after that, temperatures would fall below the level that human life could be sustained. In other words, we have to have that constant energy from the sun, or we are an ice cube. We're simply
history. Well, there's coming a time in the book of Revelation when men will be scorched with great heat. Now, what is this really talking about? What do you think will happen to cause that?
J.R., this is fascinating. And you have written on the book of Revelation, and you've devoted many hours of thought to this, I know. Some people say that there are multiple blackouts of the sun, where the sun goes black, perhaps 1 or 2 or 3. I've seen as many as 5 times suggested for the sun to go black and then come back to its normal light again. But there is at least one solar blackout in the book of Revelation. It's quite well described, particularly in, and I believe it's in Revelation chapter 16, if I'm not mistaken, where the vials are poured out on the sun. And we have that, and I'm going to look it up right here. It's in the 4th vial. The 4th angel poured out his vial upon the sun. Power was given him to scorch men with fire. We find the theme of the sun's radiation being increased interspersed with the theme of the sun being totally blacked out. Isaiah speaks of the sun as being at one point 7 times warmer than normal. We don't know for how long, but I take it that the 4th vial and the event described by Isaiah are the same event. You know, at some point, an angel tampers with the sun in some way to cause it to produce more heat. And it says here, and men were scorched with great heat and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues. In other words, God can control the output of the sun. Just sends forth his holy angels, and we don't know what they do, but they do something that causes the sun to change its radiation output. And they repented not to give him glory. Now, J.R., these would be the very same people who speak of anthropogenic climate change. They do not credit God with controlling heat and the climate.
Yes, and blame man.
They blame man.
Now, why would they do that? They are usually the people who are in charge of all these greenhouse gases. We're talking the corporations, the oil cartel. These people, what are they doing? Trying to scare humanity into submitting to world government?
JR, essentially that's it. They're trying to control the transfer of wealth. In other words, if you are considered a high-end carbon producer, then you are considered to be in violation, and you have to transfer carbon credits over to the less productive. This is nothing more or less than the transfer of wealth. from the richer to the poorer, supposedly to even out the means of production. It's nothing more than communism expressed as meteorology. That's all it is.
Now, the Kyoto Protocols addresses this problem. And as I understand it, the United States has not really signed on to the Kyoto Protocols, but are moving in that direction.
Right.
But a lot of the rest of the world has, I guess in, shall we say, lockstep because of the United Nations pressure that is being put upon them. But China throws every caution to the wind.
Oh, yeah.
They don't care.
Producing carbon hand over fist. They say that there are places in central China where the sun is blocked out by the smog, and nobody cares. JR, there's a United Nations committee called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is trying to achieve the power of consensus. That is, the power to control thought on a global scale. Well, they brought forth the Kyoto Protocol, in which they said that they're basically forcing the big producers of carbon dioxide to scale back, to slow down the level of global warming or greenhouse gases. Now, over 160 nations signed on to these protocols. Actually, what they did is they submitted to the protocols, which are, in fact, quite punitive if you break the rules. The United States did not sign on because there are still enough people in our country, I think, with common sense to resist that kind of global piracy, that kind of global authoritarianism. But who knows how long that'll last.
Well, according to Joel, the day of the Lord is going to be, as he says, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, as the morning spread upon the mountains. A fire devoureth before them. Behind them a flame burneth. The land is as the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Gary, here you say Joel has made a fivefold declaration. And of course, Joel being, I guess, setting the standard for the end of days, talking about the day of the Lord. And in particular, Joel refers to first the darkness and gloominess, and then a fire devoureth before them. So he's got both global freezing and global warming, it looks to me like.
Well, there is, and it's very difficult for us to imagine the details, but we know that there is going to be both darkness and extreme heat. For example, in Revelation 16, the fifth angel pours out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and the kingdom was full of darkness. And they gnawed their tongues for pain and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores. Somehow the radiation of the sun is being interfered with here. It produces great light. Isaiah refers to that light as being sevenfold. That's in Isaiah 30, verse 26, where it says, "Moreover, the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun. The light of the sun shall be sevenfold as the light of 7 days." So in some way, the sun is going to vacillate from extreme brightness to extreme darkness, and men are going to be ravaged with sores. They're going to be gnawing their tongues for pain. Imagine this. We are urged to put on sunscreen, to wear UV absorptive lenses in our glasses so that we will not be hurt by ultraviolet radiation, so we will not suffer skin cancer. Imagine what would happen if the sun were tampered with in this way. And you wouldn't dare go outside without being totally covered up. Imagine how hot it would be inside a car if the sun were 7 times in brightness. You literally couldn't get inside that car. We're talking about horrors here that make what is currently being called global warming look like nothing at all.
Now, this is during the Battle of during the Battle of Armageddon, isn't it?
This is right.
This is right at the end of the 7-year tribulation.
I think so, yes.
When it looks like man is doomed, and the only one who can save them is the second coming of Jesus Christ. Finally, at last, the world will have to admit there is a God. That's what's going to be, I think, the big kicker in this whole thing.
Absolutely.
The Lord is coming back. And he's coming to judge the world, isn't he?
He's coming to judge the world. He's coming to destroy a corrupt system that has been developing literally for millennia, ever since Nebuchadnezzar and the head of gold in that statue that we talk about. This global system has been developing and developing. And right now, JR, it is the global system that is boosting this whole concept of anthropogenic climate change. And they're doing so for the purpose of gaining control. I am convinced gaining control over humanity by imposing the threat of a terror, which they claim that only they will be able to stop. So you must sign on to their treaty, or else all this horrible fate is going to befall humanity.
Now, Gary, I've got to ask you. It is true that around the North Pole area, the ice has melted. There's an ocean there. There's no land. It's water now. And there used to be glaciers in the Rocky Mountains. They're now just little lakes. And the ice in the Antarctic is melting and falling off into the ocean. In fact, some say that the ocean is going to rise. I don't know that that's true or not, but the fascinating thing is it is getting warmer. Now, what's causing that?
Well, JR, would you believe, and here I think we're free to put a lot of thought from a biblical perspective into this whole idea, namely, what caused those glaciers to start melting 1,000 years ago? Because they've been melting for 1,000 years. As a matter of fact, all of North America used to be covered with glaciers, right down to Oklahoma. There were woolly mammoths wandering around here, and we often, home builders will start to excavate for a foundation. They'll find the skeleton of a woolly mammoth. What caused those glaciers to retreat 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago? I am convinced that the great flood of Noah brought a huge rain of ice upon the earth, and that ice has been in the process of melting ever since, and we're now almost at the end of the period when that ice was melting. Now, that's just my personal opinion.
So, it's like when you have a big snowstorm in the winter, and the springtime comes, and it begins to thaw, and you can't tell that it's thawing until it gets right down to the last few piles in your front yard, and then it just starts disappearing right away, and you wake up to realize that the snow's almost gone. That's what you're saying.
That's what I'm saying, and I'm saying that it's been disappearing not just for the last 100 years, but for the last 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. Ever since the days of Noah, I am convinced that ice heaped up in the northern hemisphere. It's been melting ever since, long before there were SUVs and heavy-duty manufacturing.
Now, before the flood of Noah, the Bible says it didn't rain. So there was some kind of a heavenly control of our weather system, so that mist came up out of the earth and watered everything. But with the flood of Noah, a tremendous change in the ecology occurred.
Absolutely, and that change in the ecology was not caused by man, it was caused by God. Genesis 2:3 says, "Every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground." Notice that phrase, the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth. That points out the cause of the rain. It's God that's causing the rain.
Do you remember in the Old Testament days, the Lord promised the Jewish people that he would let it be nice weather for 5 days, and then over the weekend it would rain. And it would rain while they were enjoying their Sabbath rest, so that it would not impede their work in the fields. And this was true for centuries. The Lord allowed the rain to come on the Sabbath while the people were resting. So that's a divine control, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think Christians should begin to adopt that perspective. I think maybe we've almost forgotten that it's the Lord who blesses the earth with the rain. It's the Lord who creates the favorable climate. It's the Lord who blesses your crops and your fields. It is not the SUVs ripping our atmosphere apart. J.R., man was created by God to take dominion over this planet and to keep it stable, to be a good steward here. And I think in general, man has been a good steward of the planet and will continue to be, because it's in his own best interest to keep it that way.
But when it comes down to the finality of it, man is not the cause of global climate change. Sunspots are. Would you say that's the basic underlying problem?
I think there's very great evidence for that. Very great evidence indeed.
And there is a God in heaven, and he is in complete control. You know, when the judgment comes, and it could be in a few years, decades, we don't know exactly when, but I think we have reached very close to that time. People need to receive Christ as their Savior. That's the only hope. This is J.R. Church and Gary Sturman. Until next time, keep looking up.